All right, today we're going to talk about Chapter 6, Extinction Risk. When we first start talking about extinction risk, we want to identify and support that this current levels of extinction are human caused, and what we see is from this graph is that we've accumulated species on Earth over all of the different events through geologic time that have happened. Now, during these times, we've had extinction events, and what we're noticing now is that our extinction events are larger than what our fossil records indicate, and they also are affecting more species, more different kinds of species and different groups than what previously occurred when things were just, say, changes in climate or something like that that affected only reptiles, like dinosaurs, versus now we're having huge effects off of a range of species that may otherwise be adapted to multiple climates and many different habitats, but the combined forces of climate change, habitat loss, and all the other factors we've talked about are really leading to increased extinction rates and a link to human cause of those. So we can also kind of envision extinction risk based on IUCN database of species. We can look at that over time as well, and so these different groups that shown here are ones in which all species have been assessed at least twice by the IUCN. And from these data, what we see is that the status of each of these major groups is declining, but some are faster than others. Corals, for instance, were in the 1990s had very low extinction risk, and now those cumulative effects of ocean acidification and climate change are really speeding up their extinction risk, whereas amphibians were always on decline and are slowly increasing in that risk of decline. Now, there's different types of extinction that we need to understand. Obviously, the word extinct, we all get that. It means a species no longer exists on Earth. But we can also have species that are extinct in the wild. And those are things that no longer exist in the wild, but we have captive animals in zoos. That still have some breeding populations, but effectively there's none known to be in the wild. We also have locally extinct populations, something that's extirpated. They're extinct from a given area, but the populations of that species is elsewhere. So when we think of that, think of something like wood bison in western Alaska. That was locally extinct until we reintroduced them. Another example for Alaska is the muskox. Those became locally extinct in some parts of the state. However, populations existed elsewhere, and we were able to reintroduce those populations. And some of those actually were reintroduced after being kept as captive animals in zoos, etc. So zoos actually play a pretty big part, and wildlife conservation centers, such as the one south of Anchorage, Alaska Wildlife Conservation Center, play a big part in these reintroductions. We also have functionally or ecologically extinct. Those are used interchangeably, and that's when we have so few of a particular species left that they don't interact with other species. The example the books uses is this baiji, which is a Chinese river dolphin, and it had no confirmed sightings since 2006, but they have an unconfirmed sighting from 2016, which might mean that species is still in existence, but it's essentially ecologically or functionally extinct because its numbers are so low that it's not impacting other species. So when we talk about extinctions, oftentimes we prioritize island populations and island conservation in general more than others, and that's because we tend to have a higher rate of extinction there on islands. And it's because in islands we usually have small population sizes and less previous exposure to either humans, other mainland species, or both. This graph here shows the island bird species and their extinctions rates over 25-year periods. The island species are in blue bars and the mainland species are in green, and so you can see the obvious huge differences in the extinction rates, where we only have maybe a a few to a handful of species that are going extinct on the mainlands, and many species going to extinct on islands. That human exposure, lack of human exposure, keeps them from being adapted to the effects of humans, whether that's hunting or habitat loss. In fact, many of the large mammals in North America are thought to have gone extinct because we didn't co-evolve with those species, like what happened with elephants and lions and things like that in the African and Eurasian continents, as humans expanded out from there and came to similar species like woolly mammoths in North America and other places. Those species started to go extinct. And then with mainland species, the migration that we have from our own activities, bringing them as introduced invasive species, whether that's deliberate or accident, as we discussed in a previous chapter, as those mainland species start to interact with these other species on islands, they can have a serious effect on them. And we've seen that with bird species in various areas, from brown tree snakes in Guam and other effects of mainland species that make it to islands. So islands are also unique and kind of make a really good proxy for understanding habitat fragmentation as well, based on how we can calculate the number of species per area on an island. And so, because we can essentially predict that number of species on an island based on the area, and we have to use this equation S equals CAZ, where S equals the number of species as we're trying to calculate, and then A is the area of that island. C and Z are both constants, and those are based on the species and then the interaction of those species and the type of area that it is, whether it's an Arctic island versus say a tropical island. And what we see with this is that the number of species essentially goes up as the size, the area of that island increases. And so, based on this equation, if we give a constant of 1 for C and 0.25 for Z, then we throw in some island areas, 10, 100, and 1,000 kilometers squared, and we can have 2, 3, or 6 species respectively on those islands. And you can see that as well in the picture in the graph. Those larger islands, Cuba, Hispaniola, have more species on them than Jamaica, Puerto Rico, and Redonda, all the way down, with those smallest islands. Now, the island biogeography model then takes this a step further and describes the relationship between the rates of colonization and extinction in islands. The immigration rates in this graph are shown in blue and red curves, and those are kind of based off of the idea of unoccupied islands, and initially have high immigration rates, and a species with good dispersal abilities basically rapidly take advantage of all that available in open habitat. Immigration rate then slows as the number of species increases and the sites become occupied on that island. The extinction rates, though, which are shown in green and gold on this graph, increase with the number of species on the island. So as we get more species, each of those individuals becomes less dominant, and when that individual becomes less dominant, they have a smaller population size and therefore have a greater chance of going extinct. So colonization rates are going to be highest for islands near a mainland population source, and so species then can disperse over shorter distances more easily than longer ones. That's why we have that higher a colonization rate in those places. And then the extinction rates, though, are highest on small islands where both population sizes and habitat diversity are low, because the island is small. The number of species present on an island will reach some sort of equilibrium when the colonization rate equals the extinction rate, and those are shown in the circles on this graph. Equilibrium number of species is really going to be greatest on larger islands that are near the mainland, and then lowest on small islands that are far from the mainland. We can take and extend this towards habitat fragments, thinking about the placement of those fragments on the greater landscape. Large fragments house more species. If those large fragments or other fragments that are closer to large fragments can have more immigration from those areas. So now we can think about extinction rate and habitat loss, and this is sort of then kind of related to that how much area is available into the number of those species, and think about it as then the loss from there, and also think about it with the island biogeography model. Then those number of species that are present in an area will increase asymptomatically, so they increase along a slope and as it rises sharply, and then it will level off eventually, and that's shown by this red curve. The shape of that curve is going to differ based on different species, different regions, their dispersal abilities, what kind of habitats are available, etc. But if you start to remove habitat from here, you can actually start to see then hypothetically how much loss we'll have from those different species in that. And again, that's going to change based on the species, the types of habitat, and the area that's available for them. So we have a bunch of different risk factors for extinction to go through, and some of them are really closely related to each other. Species that have a narrow geographic range tend to be really specialized. The Aleutian shield fern is the only endangered plant in Alaska. It's found on just one Aleutian island and tends to grow only on certain rocky slopes in the mountains on those islands that it inhabits, and makes it highly specialized and has a very narrow geographic range. So species that have that narrow geographic range, with that increased specialization, they're really vulnerable to small amounts of habitat loss and other stochastic events, which is also a reason why those species have only one or a few populations if they have that narrow geographic range. And when I mentioned stochastic events previously, what I'm referring to is major things that can happen to a species, whether that's overharvest, earthquakes, hurricanes, fire, or disease that runs through it and causes us, a major change to that population. When we have only one or a few populations, which is what is brought up here with this American burying beetle, they used to have several different populations around, spread over a very wide area. Now they've been reduced to only a few remnant populations. All of a sudden, then they can be be more vulnerable to extinction. We also have small population size that leads to low genetic diversity, and also factors that stochastic events that can lead to a decline in that species. And we'll talk more about genetic diversity here in just a minute. Island habitats, of course, increase the risk factors for extinction, because those species don't have potential for immigration from other areas, so they have those small ranges and increased specialization, as well as some of the other issues we talked about, from not having exposure to people and mainland species previously. We also have hunting or harvesting by people. That obviously is an external factor from the habitat available, and is affected by increases in human population and our need for protein or other resources, black market trade, etc. Large home ranges are another one that jumps out and deserves some explanation. When you have a species with a large home range, those are species that migrate over and use large amounts of area, and they also need to have those areas connected. And there's been some interesting studies recently that have shown that the large-bodied species tend to also require large home ranges. And so we think about things that migrate, like wildebeests, elephants, bison, buffalo, use these really large home ranges so that they can use different resources at different time of the year when those resources are available. And when those areas within that range become fragmented, and prevent their travel between them, that's when we start to see declines in those species. Large body sizes, those species with large home ranges often tend to have large body sizes as well. And when we have a species with large body size, they also tend to reproduce slowly, so that they can raise those young up over many years until they reach their sexual maturity, which is usually at an older age than smaller species. And so those large body sizes tend to be at higher risk of extinction, and they also tend to be hunted more by people as well. Slow reproduction then, is obvious reason. If you have a species that only produces one offspring every 3 years, then it's going to recover much slower than a species of, say, insect or something that produces thousands of offspring in a single year. We also have species with limited dispersal ability. So think about that Aleutian shieldford again. They don't have wind dispersed seed, because they're a fern, and they're also stuck on an island and have very little opportunity to disperse away from that area to another habitat that's suitable for them. Seasonal migrations are also another thing for risk factors for extinction. We've had many birds that have been on declines, migratory birds in particular, for a variety of reasons, but one of them is the seasonal migration and using multiple different habitats at different times of the year. When we have little genetic variation in a population, usually that's also associated with small populations or just populations that are confined to a certain area, that can lead to inbreeding depression, which we'll talk about momentarily, and is also a problem for species. Specialized niche requirements, again, things like that Aleutian shield fern living in a small area, maybe highly other species that are highly adapted to a particular species. Think of something that's specifically an insect specifically adapted to fertilizing a certain species of plant, and if that insect goes away, that plant then goes away, or if that plant goes away, the insect's food source might go away. Low tolerance for disturbance. Some species of plant and animal don't really adapt well to disturbance. Salmon are an example. If we disturb their the gravel beds, the spawning beds that they use, they can obviously be impacted. Permanent or temporary aggregations. What we mean by that is a species that either constantly stays together for throughout the whole year, or temporarily aggregates and gets together for a year. So think of caribou. They have their seasonal migrations where they tend to group up, and then for mating or for calving. And if we have that, and especially when those happen in particular areas, those species then become a little bit more prone towards extinction, because if that one area where they aggregate is impacted, or predators, humans or otherwise, congregate and are in large numbers in that area where they aggregate, then they can be adversely impacted. No prior contact with people. We've obviously talked about that before. Essentially, if they haven't developed a fear of that, they're way prone to over-harvesting. And then close relatives that are extinct is also a factor. When we talk about populations and genetic diversity, we also talk about loss of heterozygosity, and that's the rate at which genetic variation is lost through genetic drift. We can calculate that with this equation, H1 it equals 1 minus 1 over 2ne H0, where H0 is our original heterozygosity. In the population, H1 is what's remaining. That's what we're trying to calculate. And Ne is that effective breeding population, so how many animals are actually breeding in the group. This is going to change for species in different situations, and so this graph then shows the differences per site of 2 DNA sequences in genetic variation remaining after 20 generations in populations from a fly, Drosophila melanogaster. And they do this with various effective population sizes. And what that shows is that with these different initial effective population sizes, we have smaller populations having less nucleotide or heterozygosity, genetic diversity, than the ones that started with a larger effective population. So we can determine the risk of extinction based on a variety of different factors with large animals as well as inbreeding. Smaller populations, of course, have a higher risk of inbreeding, and this graph shows the results of various different studies where they calculated inbreeding coefficients with these species, and you can see as the population goes up, you have a negative relationship with that with inbreeding, meaning the population goes up, inbreeding goes down, and as the population goes down, inbreeding goes up. Makes sense. When we figure out effective population size, what we're really talking about is the number of individuals that breed. And so if we have thousands of animals, but only a handful of them are mature enough to breed, only those mature animals that are breeding can actually be counted in the as the effective population. So and that changes with things like unequal sex ratios. If we have 3 males and 5 females, well then really we only have an effective breeding population of 8. If we have and if those species then are monogamous, then we only have an effective breeding population of 3. It can also change when we have species that are really competitive, like many of our ungulates and primates that tend to have one male who mates with many females, and that then obviously decreases the number of in the effective breeding population. So inbreeding versus outbreeding depression. A basic overview: inbreeding is when individuals receive 2 identical defective alleles from their parents, and outbreeding depression is then when individuals of different species or population mate, and that reduces their fitness. People talk about the polar bear mixing with the brown or grizzly bear, and that may have an effect on the fitness as it changes their head and jaws. We also have the example of breeding a donkey with a horse to create a mule, and those mules are usually no longer fertile. But some of the more dramatic things happen when we talk about self-fertilization or selfing and plants, so we can understand the impact of outbreeding depression with this using manipulative experiments, and so which is shown in this picture. And so that showy species of orchid has more seeds per fruit with outcross, but when we outcross it, evolves well, that's what has more species and fruits when we outcross it, and involves those showy flowers attracting, whereas the orchid species that has a low seed set, if it's outcrossed, has an inconspicuous green flower. So there's a real big importance that new individuals and migration occurs. And the book uses this example of the Ngorongoro crater lion population, which had about 90 individuals before crashing from disease in the 1960s, and it had a population bottleneck, which really caused a huge loss in genetic diversity. But gene flow then occurred from the arrival of new males, and really facilitated a recovery of that population. And then that peaked in the 1980s, and then collapsed again down to 34 individuals for some time. Later, they suspect that more males arrived back into the crater and increased the genetic diversity again, and now they have a greater population. And finally, all these different factors then can show that as a species drops below a certain size and enter into what the book calls an extinction vortex. And so these factors that affect the small populations drive those populations effectively lower and lower in sort of a downward spiral towards local extinction of that species.